In general, what we have seen is a decline in the taxation on capital over several decades in various ways. The business tax, the capital gains tax, and various other ways that capital gets taxed, and a huge contributor to income.
Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we interview authors from all over the world. We're just fascinated with the writing process and individuals who have a message. They usually put it in a book for the world to read. Today we have Tim Noah, who put out a book called The Great Divergence: America's Growing Inequality Crisis and What We Can Do About It. Now, as you guys know, anybody who listens to me has been following me for years. I believe the way out of inequality is freedom and capitalism. Now, Tim may disagree with me. He may agree with me, but I'm interested in this conversation. So, Tim, thanks so much for
Mm-hmm.
being here. And tell us a
Uh-huh.
little bit about your book and your solution that's outlined within it.
Well, I don't have any single solution, but what my book is about is it's a kind of a history, really. It's about what changed in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s, so that what had been a prevailing trend where incomes were growing more equal since the 1930s, um, suddenly incomes started growing less equal in the late 70s and early 80s, and that trend has continued to the present day. Um, the it was uh, something that people were paying a special attention to, I think, around the time of the Great Recession. Uh, People became very interested in economic questions generally, and we saw kind of a return to this question of growing inequality and what caused it. And there wasn't really it was very hard to get a lot of hard information on what seemed to be causing this great divergence in incomes since the late 70s and early 80s. So I decided to write a book. It's often the case when somebody writes a book, they write it out of frustration that they can't find a book that will explain something to them.
That's the
And
answer,
this is the
right?
case. I could not get the answer to the question, well, what brought this about? And so I tried to answer that question.
So what did you find out? Because if I could go back in time and kind of do a quick little synopsis on the 50s and 60s, to me, the 50s were the great period of growth, right? It was the boomer stage, right?
Mhm.
We come back from the war, everybody's happy. They get the cars, they're traveling Route 66. It feels like freedom. Something to me happened in the 60s, and that's where I believe it broke apart. But what did you notice?
Well, what I noticed was there was no single reason why. There were a number of reasons why, and one of the reasons had to do with the fact that the colleges for a long period, and this is no longer true, but there was a long spell where colleges just were not producing enough graduates to keep up with demand for skilled labor. And so that drove inequality. There was something called the college premium, which is how much more money you can make if you have a college degree,
Mm.
and that was growing for much of this period. It's not growing right now, but it was growing for a long time, and this was really simply a function of um, the educational system not keeping up with the demands of technological change. And the U.S. had actually been quite lucky that way. The United States had committed itself at the beginning part of the 20th century to universal education. Most people lived in rural places, and there was a movement called the high school movement that got people going to high school. And it coincided with a period of really fast technological change, the fastest and most profound technological change in American history was at the during the early part of the 20th century. And if you think about it, that's when radio comes in, that's when airplanes come in, it's when motion pictures come in, it's when all kinds of refinements in industrial processes come in, new kinds of agriculture, agricultural technology, and so there was a demand for a high school degree, and then you have an expansion of college graduates too, especially after World War II with the passage of the GI Bill.
Mm.
And so you had an economy where the rising demand for a more educated workforce was being met steadily by an increase in the number of high school and college graduates. And then finally, that stopped happening in the 80s, and you saw a separation between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one driver of income inequality. Another driver of income inequality was the decline of labor unions. Labor had been very strong in the 1930s and 1940s.
Steel, right? Steel. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You're talking about the steel industry started to decline 60s and 70s, but it really was booming in the 30s and 40s.
Yes, absolutely. And so after World War II, there were fears that the economy would return to a depression, and there were fears about inflation, and a Republican Congress was voted in, and that Republican Congress passed a law called the Taft-Hartley Act, which really very severely curbed organizing activity in a way that had a gradual but profound long-term effect on labor unions. So that's why when you look at the United States compared to other comparable economies around the world, we've seen some decline in labor just because of the rise of international trade, but it's much worse in the United States, and that difference is, I think, largely attributable to Taft-Hartley. And so today you have a labor movement that's just absolutely on the ropes. We've seen some, revival of strike activity, and there's a lot of interest in labor unions. Unions are more popular than they've been in a generation, more than a generation. But we still have very low union density. Only about 6% of the private sector workforce belongs to a union.
Did you notice throughout your research the information potentially was adjusted? What I've seen, and I've read a book. I read a book called Rich Dad Poor Dad. Have you ever read that book at all?
I don't know that book.
All right. It basically outlines the difference between certain philosophies, how the rich think and how the poor think. And what I noticed after interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs is that they adopted a certain philosophy in life, and that has served them well. But that philosophy is not taught in school. So it's almost like there are two worlds from the get-go. Individuals are given one set of information, and the other people are given a different set of information. Therefore, it's almost like two different set of roles. And if you abide by one set of roles as compared to the other, you're going to get different outcomes. That's what I noticed. Did you notice anything alongside maybe information and school systems potentially leading to this?
No, not really. I mean, the only thing I've noticed in education is that we did see an income gap grow between college graduates and people who did not hold college degrees. There was a time where having a union card was the equivalent to having a bachelor's degree, and that time is, of course, long past now. The decline of labor, I think, has a profound effect not only in lowering wages, but also kind of lowering the power wielded by union and non-union members alike. in terms of the division of sort of corporate revenues between labor and capital. You saw the capital share grew and labor share shrank, which is, of course, exactly anyone who has been a sort of student of political science, that's what you'd expect to see as labor loses power and capital grows in power. Of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, you saw a movement towards a strengthening of the financial sector at the expense of corporations. And corporations more and more had to serve the, or felt they had to serve the needs of Wall Street. And they came to prioritize stockholders over workers. And this was after a long period when it was quite the opposite. There was a long period when there was a managerial class that could, to some extent, ignore the desires of shareholders and create their own corporate culture. And a lot of people look back on that as a kind of corporate heyday that we would like to see come back again, because you had a very strong middle class, and you had people committing themselves to a workplace for life. And you had a different set of values in American capitalism than you see today. And that's, it's John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about this on the left. James Burnham wrote about this in The Managerial Revolution from the right. And it was a strong corporate culture. Corporations were very profitable. They didn't rely on banks all that much. They were sufficiently profitable that they could fund their expansion through their own revenues, and shareholders did fine, but more of the proceeds of went to workers.
Seems like a lot changed in the 80s. Maybe that's what you're talking about too, when it comes to even educational prices, right? Education in general, college tuition. If there's anything that you spotted during this book outline that is really alarming, I noticed, I worked with a lot of people that wrote about this, where they talked about how the cost of tuition and just school in general went up like 40 to 60 times more than maybe the average salary. Did you notice anything like that, where all of a sudden the prices started to get out of control? Was it because of stagflation? Was it because of just gouging of prices? I noticed that's what I was able to see. So corporate structure, definitely, maybe that's what led to the 87 crash, but there's a lot to unpack there. Have you noticed that maybe in the 80s is really the breaking point? Yeah, maybe it started in the 50s and 60s and maybe 70s, but really got crazy in the 80s.
I think where you start to see the breakdown in a lot of these trends is actually the 1970s. Even though incomes continued to be, you didn't see an increase in inequality right away, but you did see start to see a breakdown in the power of labor unions.
Early 70s with Nixon.
Throughout the 70s, I think you start to see a breakdown of labor. You start to see financialization become a more serious factor in the economy. The 1980s, I think you're right. The 1980s is when the cost of tuition started to spiral out of control.
1980, 81 it just started to break apart fast.
Yeah, and it was led by private colleges. Private colleges just got wildly expensive, and there was really no. It was so necessary to get a college education to participate fully in the economy that there was insufficient downward pressure. So you had families willing to pay anything to send their kids to college.
Yeah.
And you had kids taking on piles of debt. And of course, that's only gotten worse and worse and worse. And The increase in college tuition then spread to the public colleges as well, and you see state governments between their medical costs and their education costs really getting squeezed in their budgets, and we're still in that place today, where college is wildly expensive. It's very hard to bring down prices, the cost of tuition, and as a consequence, that route to opportunity is closed off to a lot of people. You didn't mention trade. Trade becomes a factor too. It took a while. People were actually talking about trade as being a factor in rising inequality before it really was one, but it did eventually become a factor with the rise of China.
Yep.
And also Mexico to some extent.
Labor costs, are you talking about? Because they were able to do things at a much lower price, and therefore they were competing at a level never before seen?
That's right, and they put downward pressure on incomes in the United States. People talk a lot about the loss of jobs, but in addition to the loss of jobs, you had wages going down to try and compete, and so that becomes a big problem when I think it doesn't really start to appear to a significant degree until the 21st century. And for the next, from about 2000 to 2020, we saw a huge displacement of industrial jobs.
So you talk about trade, and it makes me think of, and maybe this is tied together. In 74, I believe Nixon completely removed us from the gold standard. Now, did that come up in your research as a major pivotal moment? Because that was basically a license to print money. And if you're talking about the inequality of incomes, well, wealthy people got extremely wealthy over the next 40 years because of that, right? The moment that government can print money at will, and there's certain things in place, whether it's the education or assets, it's automatically going to be drawn to the wealthy, and that increases the gap. So did you notice anything in accordance with that gold standard removal?
I have to say that I don't see the gold going off the gold standard as a factor. It was a factor, I think, in creating or accelerating the already growing inflation in the United States. But remember that the inflation stops being a story in 1982, 1983, which is just the very beginning of growth in income inequality. So this trend in income equality actually happened during a period of very low inflation.
Got it. Interesting. Now, you say you don't present a solution in the book, but there's got to be.
I present a number of potential solutions.
Got it. Can you outline a few of those? Because I'd love to see how we work our way out of this, right? There are people out there who want regulations from top to bottom. There are some people who want total freedom. Maybe it's a combination of both, but what do you present? Or maybe a few of your top ones.
Sure. Well, I think the most one thing that I mentioned in the book that over the years I've come to think is just more and more important is a revival of labor unions, because I think that we need to give workers more power. Inequality is in large part a story about the loss of power by employees, and the only thing that can give them that power is a labor union. So I think we need to pass the PRO Act, which I don't know if you're familiar with.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is in Congress. And I think it's going to pass sometime in the next 10 years, which is remarkable because it's in large part it's a repeal of Taft-Hartley, which Democrats have been trying to do literally since 1947. And they couldn't achieve that even, during the Great Society years of LBJ. There was too much opposition. But I think that support for it is building among Democrats and even a little bit among Republicans. And because Republicans increasingly see themselves as party of the working class, and it's hard to be a party of the working class if you don't support stronger, if you don't support legislation to remove some of the impediments to labor organizing. So I think reviving labor is really the keystone. Other things that should occur, I think I talked in the book about imposing tuition price controls on colleges.
Why not, right? I think that they're out of control, completely out
right.
of control. And you brought it up. I want to make sure I note this. I used to think, right, without looking deeper, oh, well, if it's higher tuition, the individuals in school will just have more debt. But what you're really doing on the backside is individuals won't even go to college to learn certain things because I don't want to take on that debt. So it's twofold. And that I think that's significant. So yeah,
Yes.
price.
And you have to remember a lot of people are just not going to go to college anyway. So you can't make education the sole answer, which is, I think, the mistake that the Clinton administration made in the 1990s, is they were too focused on opportunity and not focused enough on equality. And to achieve equality, you have to have a solution for the people who aren't going to go to college. And I think that's where labor unions come in. Other reforms, I think we need to put a choke chain on Wall Street. And we saw the beginnings of that during the Obama administration, the first major financial reform bill since the 1930s. But it didn't go far enough. And we need to really kind of put a check on the excesses of the financial sector, and especially CEO pay, which has just become the most stark symbol of inequality that there is. You just recently had the United Auto Workers win a strike, in large part because they were able to make the very potent argument that they were just asking for the same percentage increase as the CEO had gotten. And of course, they didn't get it in the end, but they got a little closer to it. And it has gotten to the point where there are costs to a corporation. There are costs of paying CEOs so heedlessly, and it's got to stop. It's at risk of undermining the economic foundations of the corporation.
Well, what would you say about the minimum wage increase? And there are certain things in place that I think are happening now that we didn't have to worry about 30 years ago. AI, virtual assistants. You have places like Upwork. I can go to Fiverr. I can get certain things done online at a much lower price across the world. So anybody that I see promoting the minimum wage increase, I look at that as they're not thinking too far out, because it could lead to the employer or the business getting a little smarter using technology to say, well, if you want that much money, well, it's actually in our best interest to develop a software program or hire a certain virtual assistant or to build a program that actually removes your job. You're seeing it within every fast food industry as we speak. You raise the prices of the minimum wage, cool. We're going to move away from labor and we're going to get to robots doing it. So I don't know if the constant push to increase our wages is in the best interest of the workers. I look at multiple revenue streams as a solution. So what do you propose when it comes to that? Are you noticing the same things that I'm seeing?
I do like an increase in the minimum wage, and I think that the shift towards AI and all kinds of automation is going to happen anyway. So I think that I don't think that's much of an argument for denying workers a raise, and it doesn't help inequality in a direct way, because the real inequality, the growth in inequality has really been between middle class wages and upper wages. It hasn't so much been between um, low wages and top wages. That actually sort of the degree of inequality between those two fluctuates with changes in the fortunes of low income people over time, and to some degree, you know, low income people are doing better than they were before the 1960s because of income support programs. Um, uh, but there is an indirect benefit to raising the minimum wage, which is it also sort of raises wages up the chain, and that does help bolster middle class wages. So I think middle class people who sort of look at the minimum wage and say, "What has that got to do with me?" aren't considering that um, they probably stand to get a wage bump too.
Well, doesn't it just make everything cost more? I'm
Yes,
thinking of a gas
everything should
station.
cost more. The cost of labor should be higher. Uh,
So I'm looking
Absolutely.
at it from I worked at a gas station. My starting fee or was starting wage was $6.25. It was in 2001, I believe. And so if he were to pay me $15, let's just say, he would have to raise gas prices, food prices, his insurance, everything would go up, right? So I look at that as it would be such a direct shot to the vein right away, but there would be a hangover eventually where, oh, I'm making more, but I'm spending more, ultimately leading to some type of negative outcome. So
Well,
do you believe in
we've
that?
had the opposite priority for the last several decades, which has been the priority on keeping the prices of goods and services low. And that's been the way that we have quote unquote compensated lower income people with lower prices. I think it's better to compensate people with wages than with lower prices, because among other things, the lower prices are not reliable. You never know when you're going to get hit with a bout of inflation like we had in the last few years, and suddenly um, uh, low prices are not something you can count on if you're a low income person. Whereas if you have a higher minimum wage and you have higher wages generally, that is something you can generally count on.
In your book, what do you propose as the ideal outcome? The way I look at it, I'm seeing individuals. There's a individual we work with. He makes about $1 million a day. There's no
Mm-hmm.
stopping him. There is absolutely no stopping this individual from making more money. And he's going to keep growing and developing more income streams, becoming more valuable to the marketplace, growing a network. Therefore, he has more affiliates. Is the goal to stop people like that, or is it to just raise up individuals with the right information so they can start maybe investing in assets so they have multiple revenue streams, or is it just let's boost up people enough so they survive and never really have to suffer? What's the ideal outcome?
I think the ideal outcome is strong income security in the United States, strong social benefits. Nobody should have to worry about, the price of having their appendix removed. Um, uh, they've managed to achieve this in Western Europe. They've managed to take healthcare off the table as a kitchen table consideration when you're calculating um, your family's finances, and that's as it should be. And it should be the same for education, and it should be the same for higher education. Bernie Sanders talked about that when he ran for president. He didn't quite figure out how to do it, but I admire him at least for putting it on the table. So I think we want to have a society where the basics of life are provided for. And you're guaranteed health care, you're guaranteed a pension when you're old. And if you work, you get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Um, we are seeing what we're seeing now and have been seeing for a long time is a decline of the middle class. Being middle class used to be a great thing in the United States, and it is not a great thing anymore.
Right.
And I am very much in favor of restoring that, restoring that those communities, that sense of security. I think it has effects beyond the economic. I think that the tribal nature of our politics today and the deep hatreds, I think, is ultimately driven by income inequality, the loss of opportunity, and just a sense of hopelessness on the part of a lot of people.
When I see people like Bernie Sanders, I look at somebody who says a lot but doesn't do much. Now, I think that's with every politician, so I'm against all politicians, just so you know. But when I see Bernie Sanders, I see him promote the $15 minimum wage. But then when you look at his staff, they're not paid $15. So that to me is automatic hypocrisy, and it discounts you. The other side of it is he's always talking about taxing the rich. Well, he's a millionaire. Can't he just pay more in taxes? So I believe if you're going to promote something, you do it, right? So what would you say to people like that? The people in power that could really make some adjustments, they really need to do what they're saying. Is that right? What do you think?
Well, I mean, if Bernie Sanders is a millionaire and Bernie Sanders thinks the rich should pay more taxes, he's saying that he should have to pay more taxes.
Why doesn't he then?
You can't expect him to be a saint and give more. I don't think you can. They even allow it to sort of give more in taxes than you owe.
Correct. Oh, I disagree. If you have tax advantages, you don't have to take advantage of them.
I guess in that sense, yes. I guess in that sense,
but he
again,
does.
we don't expect our politicians or anybody else to be a saint. I mean, it's I think that the most you can hope for is for them to say, look, I will do my fair share if other people do their fair shares. And I think that's a very reasonable position for anybody to take. I'm not going to give away my fortune, but if everybody else is paying a lot more in taxes, then I will too. Warren Buffett, who is not like Bernie Sanders in a lot of ways, said essentially the same thing. So I don't think it's a left-right divide on that point. And there is a growing sense in this country that, as Leona Helmsley said, taxes are for the little people. And you do see wealthy people escaping taxation to a truly scandalous degree.
Well, who wrote the code? The IRS wrote the code for a reason, right? It's not the entrepreneurs who are making, or even the politicians who are taking advantage of it. The code is written. There's a 9,000 pages.
Yeah, it's not written by the IRS. It's written by Congress. I mean, the IRS merely comes up with regulations to enforce what Congress tells it to do. And you have all sorts of interest groups that are able to get various breaks from Congress.
But they're written for a reason.
You also have, pardon?
They're written for a reason, right? Those rules are in place. Tax laws are in place to benefit a certain group of people. Now, if I'm playing a game, I'm going to look at the rules and say, all right, so you're telling me if I buy a real estate and I apply this depreciation in accordance with the law, why wouldn't I if these are the rules of the game? It's like playing a sport. What are the rules? Let me play the game to the max.
Of course, yeah, I wouldn't expect anybody to do anything different, but that's why I'm in favor of changing the rules. And I'm also in favor of, and there's another dimension to it, of course, which is there are a lot of rules that are in place that don't get enforced, and they don't get enforced because Congress, and specifically the Republican Party, has a policy of denying necessary resources to the IRS. IRS lacks the resources to go after tax cheats, rich tax cheats. So what do instead? They go after poor tax cheats. If you're a poor person, you have to be out of your mind to cheat on your taxes, because the IRS loves to throw the book at those people because they're easy to catch. It doesn't take much in the way of resources. So the IRS beats the ever-loving crap out of poor people, and it lets rich people off the hook because that requires manpower and it requires a certain amount of sophistication. These guys have, great lawyers. And it amazes me that the Republican Party has a policy of denying funds to the IRS. The IRS needs support, financial support, in order to get rich people to pay their taxes.
Wait a second. Wait a second. I'm going to cut you off there. This is an interesting conversation. The IRS having more agents are not about going after the rich, right? Rich
Of course
make up
they
a
are.
very few percentage of this world. So
They
fewer
take up a
agents.
huge percentage of the abuses of the tax system because they know they can get away with it, and because they have more sophisticated lawyers. And believe me, there's a lot of money to be harvested from enforcing the laws that are on the books against rich people. There's not so much money to be made by further enforcing the laws against poor people, although I don't have any worries that about whether that will continue. Of course it will, but the government is leaving a huge amount of money on the table by not hiring additional IRS agents.
Now, do you think I believe it's the Biden administration hired 80,000 new agents over the next 2 years or something,
I don't
something along those
remember what
lines.
the number was.
But
I don't remember.
it's an absurd amount. Now, do you believe they're going to go after the rich? In my opinion, they're going to go after the middle class and the poor. So
They're
do
going to
you?
go after the rich. That's where the money is. It's like what Willie Sutton said. Why did he rob? You know the joke. He got asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "Because that's where the money is. Rich people are where the money is."
Uh,
They of course they're going to go after rich people.
Now, what do you classify as rich? I want to hear your thoughts on that. Are what are
Well,
rich?
in my book, I go through different levels of rich, but and one thing I fault Joe Biden about is I think that he is because the Democrats have become to some extent the party of the elite. He's very nervous about raising taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year. By my books, if you make $400,000 a year, you are rich. You are not fabulously rich, but you're rich,
Mm.
and you should be paying more in taxes. But there are different grades. I think we have I don't think we have a graduated income tax, um, and we should have a top rate. Should lay on more top rates, top marginal rates for the many income for higher incomes. And so we should have higher income tax rates on people who make millions, people who make billions, and so on. And there are all sorts of other things we should do. We should be taxing, we should get rid of I don't know if you're familiar with the angel of death loophole.
No, I don't know
Um,
the angel of death. What's that one
the
about?
angel of death loophole is that uh, uh, if you have an asset like a house, and it goes way up in value, when you die, the value of that house, the capital gains on that house don't get taxed. Your heirs inherit the house, but they don't have to pay capital gains on it. So basically, the capital gain on that asset over the course of um, uh, its ownership, the capital gains have completely escaped taxation. Now, that's perhaps not a tragedy for a middle class family where the kids inherit dad's house, but just consider the implications for super rich people. And then on top of that, you have this multiplication of family trusts around the country. You have the states have been competing with each other to create more and more outlandish ways to shield inherited wealth from taxation. And so we are at some risk, as the economist Thomas Piketty says, of returning to the 19th century norm, which was what he called patrimonial capitalism, where the way to get rich was to inherit it and not to make it. I think that that's a real danger. So that's yet another dimension to, in general, what we have seen is a decline in the taxation on capital over several decades in various ways. The business tax, the capital gains tax, and various other ways that capital gets taxed. And it's been a huge contributor to income inequality. I'm not saying there shouldn't be rich people, but I am saying that rich people should pay significantly more in taxes to cover their fair share than they do today.
Last two questions. How could a rich person paying more in taxes actually benefit somebody who's working at a McDonald's making $10 an hour? How would that be possible?
Because writ large, not a single person paying more taxes isn't going to achieve a lot. But if you have all the rich people paying more in taxes, then that is going to increase the amount of funds in the treasury, and it will make it easier for the federal government to create a economic security for that person who's flipping a burger. So that person who's flipping a burger probably is not getting health insurance from his boss, or if he is, he's not getting very good health insurance. And so it can provide basic health insurance to that person, or it can help that person go to college, or it can help. We could see some expansion of Social Security so that it becomes closer to a real pension. These are all things that are being done in the capitalist countries of Western Europe, and it has not been the end of capitalism. It has been an adaptation of capitalism to current needs, and I think we need to see more of that in the United States.
But doesn't that remove the power of the individual to make it on their own? And the reason why I bring that up is because the moment they say the government's going to take care of me, they kind of let their hand off the steering wheel, and they will say, you know what, no matter what action I take, the government will be there to save me, which
How about
takes
your friend
away
who
any
makes $1
type
million
of
a day?
accountability.
Do you think I think you just told me your friend who makes $1 million a day, there's
Right.
no way to stop him.
No way.
There is no way to stop people who want to make a lot of money, and you'll always be able to do better making a lot of money than you can do relying entirely on the government. That's never not going to be true. What we're looking for is just for the basic human needs to be covered. So I don't think we have to worry about the engine of capitalism sputtering to a halt. I don't think it's sputtered to a halt in Western Europe, and I don't think it's going to sputter here. But I do think that we have a society where we need to provide greater income security.
And one last point that I'll make: Elon Musk, the richest man the world has ever seen, they say. Actually, it might be a little bit different, because if you go back in time, Solomon probably was wealthier. But Elon Musk will not draw an income. He doesn't have to. How do you tax this guy if he doesn't make any money on paper? He has all these shares. He has all these assets, never draws from it. Are you saying in order to really hurt the wealthy, you need to tax unrealized income?
I don't know Elon Musk's specific situation, but obviously, since he does not live in penury, he's found some way to live very expensively without drawing anything that's actually called a large salary. I don't know what tricks he's using, but whatever tricks they are, they're tricks, and they shouldn't be permitted. It's a complex. This is why we need a lot more IRS agents. It's a complex process where you get the company to pay for things that are actually your own income, and Donald Trump does this all the time. And I just don't know enough about Elon Musk, but I guarantee you he is not subsisting on bread and water.
Well, I live off a Jim Rohn quote, and it's not, the quote is, don't wish the world to be different, wish for you to be better. And so my philosophy, and to kind of wrap up this conversation, which has been very eye-opening, this is great stuff. I don't think that the way to make more money is for someone else to lose money or to pay more. I think that the answer is giving individuals the right information from the get-go. Case in point, the book that I talked about earlier called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If I got this when I was young, when I was 7, 8 years old and was given this information, I would have saved probably 20, 30 years of doing the wrong stuff. Understanding that this $10 bill, rather than putting it into booze or rather than putting it into some type of liability, if I would have bought an asset with it to have it turn and pay me money, my life would be completely different from the very beginning. So I believe the answer to wrap things up is get the right information in the hands of the kids. And books like this or Think and Grow Rich will shift their mindset. And I think the inequality will start to become less because individuals will start playing by the rich rules rather than waiting for the rich and the government to behave a little differently. Therefore, they can maybe make a little bit more from their job. So any last words you would be able to say to give a quick little rundown on your solution? Because this has been interesting, sir.
Well, I forget who was it who said it, but there's a famous quote that if men were saints, we would need no government, and I think that's true. We are not saints, and therefore we do need government. And there have been times when the government has done a better job than it does today of protecting the common welfare, and it's not just a matter of redistributing income, although there's some of that that's entailed. It's also a question of living by the motto "E pluribus unum." You know, I was in the Moynihan train station yesterday in New York, and they have I don't know if you've been there. It's the new version of Penn Station in New York
No?
City, and they have it says "E pluribus unum," and then next to it they translate it in English of many one. And I just thought, wow, it's come to this. Everybody in my generation knew that e pluribus unum meant of many one, not because we studied Latin, but because it was on the currency and we talked about it a lot. I mean, it was like knowing the Pledge of Allegiance. And now we live in an era where the idea is so foreign that if you're going to say e pluribus unum on the wall of a new train station, you then have to have an English translation because people are not familiar with the idea. And that made me sad. I think that we really need more of that spirit in the United States, and it's not a socialist idea. It's an idea about a sense of common purpose, and I would very much like to see a restoration of that.
It's great. Are you a Christian man at all, sir?
No, I am
No.
not.
Have you ever heard of the Matthew principle at all, or the story of the talents that relates to the Bible? Have you ever heard of that?
I don't know. No.
Well, in the story of the talents, there's basically a man who has 3 children, and he gives each of them a talent, and then comes back 6 months later and says, "Hey, show me your talents. What have you done with it?" One guy says, "I've taken this talent and I've grown it to 10." Another guy says, "I've taken this talent, I've grown it to 20." And the other one says, "I've taken this talent. I wanted to save it because I didn't want to lose it. So I buried it deep down inside. Here you go. Here's your 1 talent back." And he says, "All right, that 1 talent, I'm going to take it away from you and give it to the one that grew it to 20. And because this is the Matthew principle, to those who have everything, more will be given. To those who have nothing, all will be taken. And what it means is if you are given these resources, skills, and tools and ideas, and you do nothing with it, eventually it's going to be all taken from you and given to the poor or given to the wealthy. Therefore, it's like the capitalistic approach. So in order for you to become better, you take all these skills and resources, information, and you apply it to grow and to scale and to build more. And I think that it's so relatable to this world. So we both have 2 different visions of the future. Hopefully the inequality does decrease. And I
You
believe it
are in
starts with
favor of
education.
inequality decreasing, then, because
Absolutely.
there are
I
people who
I
are not.
want everyone to be wealthy and rich, and I want everybody to read these books. That's why I talk about these on my podcast. I want people to become entrepreneur-like. Don't worry about one income stream.
I have absolutely nothing against entrepreneurs. I think they are good for society. Absolutely. I am not anti economic growth. I think that they make a lot possible in our society. But I also think that they should be paying their fair share. And I think that not everybody's going to be Steve Jobs.
No, yeah, that's for sure, right? There are magicians out there that are just incredible, but yeah, my philosophy, I'm with you. I like the message. Inequality needs to decrease, but the way to do it is to get people all feeding from the same trough of the right information. And I love the entrepreneur mentality because it's just complete freedom in every aspect. So yes, have everybody make more money. Don't go into serious debt, into liabilities through like tuition, and invest in assets that pay you money weekly, monthly, yearly, constantly for the rest of your life. So that's what I say. Get rich and don't worry about what other people are doing. Focus on your own talents, very much like the story in the Bible. So thank you so much, Tim. It's been an
Okay.
honor. I really appreciate you sitting down and talking to a guy that doesn't share the exact vision of yours, but this was a great conversation. So is there anything else you want to say to the audience, whether a way to get a hold of you, any other books that you have out there, anything?
Well, I just like to show a copy of my book, The Great Divergence. There are actually two books called The Great Divergence. One of them is not written by me. This is the one that's written by me, and it's about income inequality. And I wrote it about a dozen years ago, and it is again a kind of history. So I think it has stayed relevant, and I think it. My ambition when writing it was that it would. I'm a former Wall Street Journal reporter, and so my approach was to approach it like a Wall Street Journal reporter would, to be very factual in presenting the causes, the growth of income inequality, and not be an opinion journalist until the last chapter when I present solutions. And so I wrote it to be received respectfully from conservatives, and it actually was, which was very gratifying to me. They all said they thought the last chapter was crazy, of course, but there wasn't much they could dispute in the content of the previous chapters because it just traced how this happened, and um, it's a it is a documentable reality.
It's great. Yeah, I got to check out that last chapter. I've not read his book, guys, but I think he's very well spoken. He's obviously well read if you look at his library in the background. So the Wall Street Journal hopefully was a lot more accurate back in your day. When did you retire?
Well, I'm not retired, but I left the Wall Street Journal in 1996 before Rupert Murdoch took over. I have to say, I still think it's a pretty good newspaper. I think it's not quite as good as it was under the previous ownership, but I think it is far and away the best news property that Rupert Murdoch owns, and I have to give him credit for kind of standing by the editorial standards there.
Yeah, I have a big issue with Rupert Murdoch and, Jeff Bezos. Anytime you have somebody who has this machine behind them and they own a media source, there is something to be said that you can never really trust it from start to finish simply because there is an agenda that's attached to them. So hopefully, if you noticed it, I don't read the Wall Street Journal, but I know with the Washington Post, I can't trust everything simply because, hey, if this guy's pulling the strings, who knows where he wants to take the world. So
Well,
just be a little
I
weary.
have to put in a good word for Jeff Bezos, which is unusual because I've been very critical of Bezos and his capacity as head of Amazon. But I have only praise for his stewardship of the Washington Post. He has uh, kept his hands off the coverage to the point where some of the toughest coverage of Amazon's labor practices is in the Washington Post. And he's been very smart about that. He knows that the Washington Post has no value if it loses its credibility. And so he has not turned it into a tool of uh, his ideology. I don't even know that he's all that ideological. I think he's mostly about getting rich. Um, But you know, the editorial page is kind of conservative, but I have to say it was kind of conservative under the previous ownership too. So that's I think the Washington Post is remains a first-rate news source. The New York Times remains a first-rate news source. The Wall Street Journal. I think these are all news publications that have kept their head at a time when we've seen a lot of idealization of the news.
Tim, I think we're going to have to save it for another day to talk about our battle between your views on the media compared to mine, because that's a whole nother conversation. I've just lost all respect for all media in the past couple of years. So let's save that for another time. But Tim, thank you so much for everything you were able to share with us today. Guys, Tim, Noah, is it Tim or Timothy? What do you prefer?
Timothy is my line. Yep.
Okay, so it's Timothy. I apologize for saying it wrong before.
Well, people
Tim,
call me Tim, so that's fine. Yeah.
I saw how you filled out the form and it was Tim, so I was like, I gotta make sure it's Tim. But Timothy Noah, pick up the book, check it out. $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on, guys.
Thank you very much.